Have you been enjoying the games of the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz? Because I know I have. The faster time control leads to a lot more interesting games, and frankly, a lot more decisive results. And today we had day 3 of the Rapid, so we have the last 3 rounds. Tomorrow we begin the Blitz, which is going to be 9 games, and then 9 games the next day, as they have single round robin. Interesting matchup to begin. We have Alireza Firouzja with white, Magnus Carlsen with black. These two have played each other a ton, Banter Blitz Cup final, for example, and began with a Nimso Indian. Whole point here is to prevent white from playing e4, because you have the pin on the knight to the king. Alireza plays f3. This is not a main line, but it's a common idea to try to play e4. It's called the Samish variation. We get d5, and really, the interesting part of the opening happens right here, where Magnus forces Alireza's bishop to move a second time, and then plays b6. Obviously, he's got ideas to play bishop a6 to trade the bishop, but how should Firouzja finish his development? Well, if you're thinking knight e2 and castle, you're thinking correctly. That's what he should do. And he played a move here which I totally don't understand. He played bishop d3. And we see the idea. He intended to meet bishop a6 with the move c4, offering a trade of queens. But Magnus is happy with a trade of queens, even if it damages his pawn structure, since he then will play the move knight c6, rook c8, rook d8, and he's going to smash these pawns. And even though he has doubled pawns, it doesn't really matter, because he's going to break through to Alireza's position before Alireza has a chance to consolidate. And really, for the duration of the game, that's what happened. Magnus jumped in with the knight, then he chopped in the center and centralized his pieces, and won the c4 pawn. There's just no way to protect this. So he picks up a pawn, and he punishes Alireza's king's position by playing the move knight f4, so he can't take, and threatens knight d3. Alireza was forced in this position to trade the queen, and literally resigned. In a position where at first glance it only looks like he's down a pawn, but he can't defend his knight. And he also can't defend against the threat of bishop b3, which would dislodge the rook from being the only protector of the bishop. And the game is simply over. Just knight c5, and the game is over, and Alireza resigns. He is definitely not playing up to form. I don't know exactly what's going on with Alireza, but he always plays exciting, interesting, dynamic chess, and he hasn't seemed to be himself over the past few days. In the first round, we also saw Alexander Grischuk versus Lenier Dominguez. This was not a super interesting game. It began as a Catalan with g3. I do have a video on this, but we're going to go all the way to move 60. Where the players simplified a rook and 3 versus rook and 2 endgame down to an endgame that was king and 2 pawns versus king and 1 pawn. Now apparently here the move king g2, king e2 was played in the game, but king g2 is winning for white. King and pawn endgames in time trouble are extremely tricky, and oftentimes it comes down to one move. For example, king f5, king f3, opposition to the enemy king, so the king has to move. And here you play king e3, f5, and there's a way here for white to basically waste moves and win this pawn. Even if it costs him his own pawn, he will have 1 pawn remaining and it will win the game. So for example, sample variation. King f3, king g6, king f4, king f6, f3. And now the king has to give way to you. You outflank, and basically black is going to run out of moves. And black runs out of moves and you win the pawn. In the game, we got king e2, which is now a draw. And then Grischuk here was realizing that it was a draw, so he played king f1, and Lenier had to go back to meet this king idea of coming this way. And he didn't. He played this way and just lost the game. Lost the game. King h4, and if you go back here, and I win. Doesn't matter that you get this pawn. This is just a winning king and pawn endgame. So a couple of super GMs doing some crazy stuff. Grischuk gets the win. And let me show you the game between Aronian and Hikaru. This game was craziness. It was also a Nimso with e3 instead of f3. And the players got into a relatively standard position where one guy has the isolated pawn, but a pretty solid setup of pieces. But the game got really exciting around move 15. When Levon Aronian played the move bishop takes h6. Sacrificing a bishop and getting a position where he's got a queen near the enemy king. He would love to play rook d3, And that was an option here to try to play rook h3. He can't go to g3 because he'll get taken, but to go to h3. Instead, he sacrificed a second piece. And Levon won back a couple of pawns. He has 3 extra pawns here. But for Hikaru to not get checkmated here, you need to find a way to give back material but stabilize your king. And that's actually exactly what he does. He gives away the bishop, but plays a move offering a trade of queens, and gets the following position where his king is more or less safe. And then Hikaru started going into stage 2 of the game, where he was using his 6 minutes to 1 minute time advantage to stabilize and simplify a little bit. So first he trades a pair of rooks. Then he picks up a pawn with check and offers, well, Levon kind of forces more or less a trade of queens. Levon offers a queen trade, and we get bishop back to c8. Now it's going to be a race. The 3 pawns versus the 2, and that's exactly what begins to happen. Both sides trying to create stability against the other pawns. Pawn race begins. You invest fully in the b pawn, and it's black's pawn that is faster because these pawns struggle. If you push one, you risk getting your pawns blocked. If you push the other, you risk getting your pawns blocked. And so Levon had to drop his knight back to defending the passed b pawn, and this allowed Hikaru time to activate the rest of his pieces. Again, these pawns can't really come forward because, as you'll see, they get blockaded, which is sort of the problem. And this is a blockade, but it's a piece that doesn't create any threats, whereas the king is constantly creating threats on the pawns. And what ends up happening is that all 4 of black's pieces, the most important ones, not being the king because it's not really participating, start to swarm the position, and a gorgeous tactic uncorked on move 63, the stunning move bishop b5 check. It looks like you can take. Frankly, I mean, you actually have to. It is the best move. But then knight c3 comes, the rook is won, and the final move of the game is an x-ray of the king to the knight, and the king cannot move to protect the knight because the knight from b1 covers, Levon Aronian resigns, and Hikaru bounces back from a rough second day with a win. The final decisive game of the first round happened between Pentala Harikrishna and Jeffrey Xiong. This game was a modern defense, so already very interesting stuff out of the opening. Pentala starts with a very direct plan. I always recommend meeting the King's Indian with a long castles and an h4 attack, but it was a pretty imbalanced position, and it was a long game. Pentala got a pretty sizable advantage early on. He was pressuring Jeffrey. He was playing very well, actually. At some point later on, it looked like it was a Fisher random game more than anything else. It did not look like the position was resembling anything normal. But I'll jump ahead to around move 50 because it was a very long endgame. Very long endgame, which resulted in rook and knight versus rook and knight with 3 pawns for Pentala and 1 pawn for Jeffrey. Pentala was stabilizing and trying to make these pawns go, and that is exactly what he did. The reason why this pawn endgame, knight and pawn endgame is winning is because one side dominates the other. It's that the problem here is that even though white is only up 1 pawn, black technically should be able to draw this. The knight is stuck on the side of the board and just can't save itself. King b7 is coming, and if you play knight b8 check, I go here. And normally you have a check to sacrifice the knight for the pawn, but the knight covers. And so there's no way for the enemy knight to prevent, and it comes down to 1 pawn. But Pentala wins a very nice game against Jeffrey. We will move on to the second round. In the second round, we got a game between Wesley So and Levon Aronian. Levon struggled in the first round. Let's see if he was able to bounce back. This one, I'm also going to jump ahead to move 40. You might say, Levy, why are you doing that? Well, because it was a Berlin. It was a Spanish, it was a Berlin. It was a very, very solid and symmetrical structure by the players. Super boring, honestly, more than anything else. Everything is the exact same. They traded rooks very quickly. But I'm jumping ahead to move 40 because here Wesley So plays brilliantly. If you look at this position, Wesley is down a pawn. However, he has a bishop for a knight, which already is nice. And on top of that, he has a lot more space. Black can't really move, and black is struggling with a space disadvantage. So he slowly starts to shut down Levon's moves. Levon basically pushes as much as he can, then he has to lose a pawn to Zugzwang. Then bishop to d6 starts cutting squares away from the knight. And he plays the move f3, which restricts the knight from coming to e4. Then he forces the knight back to the corner, and plays bishop e7, so now the knight only really has one square to go where it doesn't get taken, and you're looking at this. That is what you want in this position with the white king, and he centralizes the king, and there it is. Bishop d8, the knight now has no squares besides g7, which would lead to an infiltration. He completely takes away all the squares that Levon has, makes Levon sacrifice a pawn, and begins advancing his own pawns. The majority that he has, which is the 2-on-1, picks up this pawn, and at the very end of the game, in picturesque fashion, traps Levon's knight on the edge of the board. The knight has no moves, and Levon Aronian resigns. This position basically shows you why a bishop in a knight endgame with a space disadvantage, you will run out of moves very quickly. That's why a bishop is better than a knight. Just straight up. There's no other way you can really cut it. The other game of the round, which had a decisive result, was the one between Linné Dominguez and Jan Nepomniachtchi. There's a reason why Jan Nepomniachtchi is on the thumbnail. Sometimes he cooks up delicious things in the kitchen, and sometimes the recipe explodes, the kitchen is on fire, and there is no fire extinguisher to be found. In this game, Jan Nepomniachtchi played the Caro-Kann, which has been played a lot in this tournament. But unlike every other grandmaster with bishop f5, Jan plays the move c5. Now, at the beginner level, the intermediate level, and even up until like the level of 2000, I like the line c5. But Linné plays the critical approach. He takes the pawn. That's what white is supposed to do, and invest in this pawn and have a space advantage in the center. And here, he plays a super interesting approach, where rather than getting this bishop out of danger, he just castles. And he's essentially saying, dude, I don't care if you have the two bishops, because you are so far behind in development, and it comes back to bite you. Watch what happens when Nepo gets greedy and takes the pawn on h4. Take, and knight to e4, creating the threat of knight d6, and you can't castle because rook takes d7. So we get bishop c6, knight d6, and the sacrifice of a rook. Not really a rook for a knight, but Linné Dominguez doesn't care. He's not interested. He's going to go bishop c5 and create even more threats. So Nepo offers the knight, says take, I'm going to create mating threats. Linné says, dude, what are you doing? You're like the crazy guy who stumbles around the street and yells at everybody with this knight h3. Plays bishop d5, potential bishop c4 idea. Rook is coming down to c2 potentially. Nah, bishop d5, let me just take that guy. If you take, suddenly I have a fork and I'm picking up a piece. Queen takes d5, and Jan resigned. I don't really think there's much else to say about this game. Linné wins. So we move to the third round. In the third round, the first decisive result that we had was a game between Levon Aronian and Linné Dominguez. And this one was in Italian, so we got a d3 and c3, the Gucci piano. A position where black plays d5 very quickly. Linné is a very principled guy, he plays a lot of e4, e5, but things got very spicy. I know you guys like when I call position spicy. Things got spicy right here, where Levon invited the capture on f3 and the doubling of his pawns. Now, normally this is not good, but because he has such active bishops, his position's completely fine. And Linné is actually the one that has to worry. So, immediately, Levon starts to fight. He kicks this knight out, forces it to move back, and plays the move knight to g5, hitting the f7 pawn. You cannot just take this, because I'm going to sacrifice my queen for the two rooks, and then I'm going to play rook d8, and you're going to die, is basically what's going to happen. So Linné plays the move knight d5. He blocks the bishop from finding the f7 square, and he wants to play the move c6. A brilliant move here from Levon Aronian. Playing the move queen to g4, offering a queen trade, and in doing so, removing the defender of d5 and fixing his structure. After c6, the knight came back to f3, to avoid getting taken, and he's creating the threat of f5. You cannot take on f4 here because you are going to lose tactically. All your pieces are messed up. I'm going to take, if you take like this, I take your rook. If you take like this, I will take the bishop on e7. So you can't take my pawn, and instead Linné backs up to f8, which results in a crashing through an extra pawn. Rook comes down to d8, pinning the bishop to the king, and after knight d4, Linné resigns. Very weird day for Lenier Dominguez, and also a weird day for Levon. Levon goes 0 for 2, and then he wins the final round, whereas Lenier gets a present from Jan Nepomniachtchi in the second round of the day, but then loses like this. Just, I mean, Levon playing a beautiful game and defeats Lenier Dominguez. There was also some excitement in the game between Pentala Harikrishna and Wesley So. This one was also a Berlin. Wesley playing into this variation once again. I believe it was the last round, if I'm not mistaken. It was Wesley with the white pieces against Levon, slowly beating him, and now he has the black pieces on the same exact side of this, the symmetrical structure. So that's what you have to do to become a super grandmaster. You have to play the Berlin with white and with black, and you have to play it successfully. But this game got away from Harikrishna quickly. Shuffling through the moves here because navigating these positions of the symmetrical kind it's not the most interesting thing in the world, but here we have an interesting moment. Pentala looks like he's just going to win all the pawns on the queen side, but he can't. If he plays knight c7, Wesley plays knight f5, hits the queen, and if you play something like queen d3 protecting against queen g3 check, knight e3 comes, and my knight and queen are going to destroy your king while your knight is stuck here. So Wesley has what is that called? Like a spring? I'm going to do this in one take, so I don't know the word, but like a slingshot. You know, you pull it all the way back, and if you let it go, it's going to be chaos. So a repetition of moves was offered, and Wesley decided to continue the game. Wesley then activates his knight and his queen, and trades into an endgame where the material is identical. Knight and 6 versus knight and 6. But then he demonstrates why he's top 10 in the world in most of the rating categories. He leaves Hari with 4 pawn islands, pawns that don't have any neighbors. And then his trio of pawns here, along with his passed A pawn, serve as the deciding factor. He slowly picks up Harikrishna's pawns, getting down into a knight endgame with a pawn advantage. Then he plays a very instructive move, h5, blocking out the knight from hitting these pawns. And before Hari has a chance to play knight f4, he plays king d6, and he was intending to meet this move with a fork of these two pieces, and converts this game with some flair by sacrificing the knight and getting 3 pawns, and here Pentala resigns, and Wesley So wins. The other decisive result of the final round was between Magnus Carlsen and Alexander Grishuk. A Sicilian defense from Magnus, a dragon, which then became kind of a Dragendorf, a Dragdorf, a6 and g6, and this cool variation h5, early h5 from Magnus, where he does not allow g4. Players castling on opposite sides of the board, so you know we're going to get a spicy Sicilian. But e5 was a little bit too bold out of Magnus, blocking in his own bishop, and then we saw a positional approach to the Sicilian from Grishuk. Rather than going crazy on this side of the board with a pawn storm, Magnus sacrificed an exchange to hit the b3 pawn, but Grishuk began to stabilize, and slowly won all of Magnus's queenside pawns. All Magnus could do here was rely on the fact that his opponent was Alexander Grishuk, which meant that he had 5 seconds on the clock for the duration of this game to create some counterplay. But because Grishuk was able to stabilize and get into an endgame where he just has a rook for a knight, there was nothing that Magnus could actually do. Grishuk stabilizes his structure and begins to move his pawns forward, activates both of his rooks, defends his only weakness, and even though Magnus is coming forward with the pawns, in this position he had to resign. Because the bishop is hit, the pawn is hit, and 2 funny things came out of this result. First, Alexander Grishuk on his interview after the game said that it was his goal to finish in 9th place in this tournament because nobody wants to be in last. So Grishuk finishes in 9th place, but actually, at the end of all of the rapid, it is not Magnus Carlsen leading the event. It's Wesley So, actually. And spoiler alert, Grishuk is not in 9th place. That was a joke. Grishuk is actually, with 10 points, sitting in a tie for 3rd with Jan Nepomniachtchi, despite Jan's disastrous day today with, 2 quick draws and 1 very peculiar loss. He is in a very close tie. The schedule now is that tomorrow we will begin the Blitz. So the players will play a round robin of Blitz tomorrow. There will be 9 points up for grabs. And the next day they will switch the colors and they will play 9 more games. So 18 games of Blitz. Let me know who you think are going to finish in the top 3. And I will see you in tomorrow's recap video.